In the quiet, pre-dawn shadows of sprawling Los Angeles estate in the year 2026, a 78-year-old man sits entirely alone in the dark. He presses a massive, weathered hand against his chest. Beneath the heavy muscle and the long, jagged white surgical scars, he can feel the steady, artificial pulse of a battery-powered pacemaker. The ultimate cinematic cyborg has finally, literally, become a machine. He is Arnold Schwarzenegger, the undisputed mythological titan of the 20th century, the 7-time Mr. Olympia who conquered the globe with pure iron, the billion-dollar action god who redefined Hollywood blockbusters, and the immigrant who seized the governorship of California. On paper, he is the flawless manifestation of the American dream. But behind the cigars and the colossal, bronze statues lies a reality of staggering, self-inflicted devastation. Behind the legend is a fiercely proud patriarch who built an impenetrable royal family, only to detonate it from the inside with a deeply humiliating, decades-long betrayal. A man who forged the most indestructible physique in human history, while secretly harboring a fatal genetic time bomb ticking inside his own chest. How did a starving Austrian boy, forced to bathe in his family's freezing, pitch-black dirty water, conquer the absolute sum of the world? What is the agonizing psychological cost of building an empire on ruthless arrogance? And what terrifying secret was hiding inside his own home, waiting to burn the king's sanctuary to the ground? Before we answer these questions, we must go back to the beginning. To understand the lonely titan at 78, you must first know the humiliated boy shivering in the dirt. Blackwater, the mechanical hum, and the ticking heart. There's a magnificent, highly engineered mythology that surrounds the concept of the self-made man. Society loves to believe that supreme ambition is born from an inspiring spark of destiny. We imagine that a champion simply wakes up one morning, looks at the horizon, and decides to conquer the world out of pure, noble passion. But true, unyielding, and terrifying ambition is almost never born from inspiration. It is born from humiliation. Arnold Alois Schwarzenegger was born on July 30th, 1947, in the small, deeply isolated farming village of Thal, Austria. The geography of his birth was defined by the bleak, agonizing aftermath of the Second World War. His country was occupied, the economy was completely decimated, and a heavy, suffocating blanket of defeat hung over the rural landscape. His father, Gustav, was a local police chief, a strict, imposing, and rigid man who demanded absolute discipline. But the authority of a police uniform could not shield a family from the crushing, visceral indignities of extreme, post-war poverty. To understand the ferocious, almost mechanical drive that propelled Arnold out of Europe, you must completely erase the image of the wealthy Hollywood superstar holding a cigar. You must step into the freezing, damp reality of his childhood home. The house had no central heating. There was no plumbing. There was no running water. When young Arnold needed to use a restroom in the dead of the freezing Austrian winter, there was no porcelain toilet. There was only a crude, indoor pit latrine. Imagine the sheer sensory degradation of that environment. A young boy sitting in the dark, feeling the biting, icy draft creeping up to the floorboards, listening to the hollow, humiliating plop of human waste dropping into the stagnant water below. It was a daily, inescapable reminder of his place at the absolute bottom of the world. But the most profound, agonizing psychological scar of his youth occurred during the family's weekly bathing ritual. Because drawing water required walking outside into the freezing cold and manually hoisting heavy wooden buckets from a neighborhood well, water was an incredibly precious, heavily rationed commodity. On bathing days, a single, large tin tub was placed in the center of the kitchen. The family used the exact same water and the exact same bar of cheap, harsh soap. In the rigid, patriarchal hierarchy of the household, Gustav bathed first. Then came his mother, Aurelia. Then his older, favored brother, Meinhard, Arnold, being the youngest, was always the absolute last in line. By the time the young, shivering boys stepped into the tin tub, the water had lost all of its heat. But more devastatingly, it had lost its transparency. The water was a freezing, murky, pitch-black sludge, thick with the dirt, sweat, and grime of his entire family. He was washing himself in the filth of others. It was a great lesson, Arnold would later reflect, attempting to wrap the agonizing memory in a layer of Stoic philosophy. But look past the tough guy facade. Look at the raw, bleeding psychology of that specific moment, when a highly intelligent, intensely proud child is repeatedly forced to submerge his naked body into freezing, black water. A quiet, dangerous vow is etched into his soul. He realizes that being last in line is not just uncomfortable, it is a physical and spiritual violation. He decided with a cold, terrifying certainty that he would never, ever be last again. He was going to build an exterior so massive, so visually overwhelming, and so absolutely undeniable that the entire world would be forced to let him go first. He was going to build a fortress of muscle. His obsession with strength was not vanity. It was armor. And his fascination with absolute power was suddenly, magically validated by the arrival of a seemingly mundane household appliance. When Arnold was a young boy, his parents finally managed to scrape together enough Austrian shillings to purchase the family's very first refrigerator. For the older audiences watching this, especially those who grew up in a rural, impoverished pockets of the mid-20th century, where preserving a simple block of butter or a pint of milk was a daily struggle, the arrival of a major appliance was an event of absolute, staggering magnitude. Arnold stood in the kitchen, completely mesmerized by the large, white metal box. He listened to the low, steady, mechanical hum of the motor. He opened the heavy door and felt the blast of manufactured, freezing air hit his face. The entire family celebrated as if they had just witnessed a miracle. To young Arnold, that refrigerator was not just a place to store food. It was a symbol of salvation. It was a machine that defied nature. It proved that if you possessed the right technology, the right machinery, you could control your environment. You didn't have to suffer. You could manufacture your own comfort. He fell completely in love with the concept of the machine. As he transitioned into his teenage years, he relentlessly, brutally punished his own body in the local gymnasiums. He lifted heavy, rusted iron until his hands bled and his muscles screamed in agony. He was actively, deliberately transforming his soft, vulnerable human flesh into the unyielding steel of the refrigerator that had fascinated him. He was turning himself into a Terminator decades before James Cameron ever wrote the script. But the universe, operated with an incredibly dark, mathematically precise sense of irony, was quietly hiding a devastating secret inside the boy's massive, expanding chest. As Arnold sculpted the greatest, most aesthetically perfect muscular armor in the history of human civilization, he was completely unaware that the very engine powering his body was fundamentally, genetically flawed. Arnold was born with a congenital bicuspid aortic valve. In a normal human heart, the aortic valve possesses 3 delicate, perfectly synchronized leaflets that regulate the massive, rushing flow of blood. Arnold's heart only possessed 2. It was a rare, insidious genetic defect. It was the exact same silent, invisible assassin that would eventually claim the lives of both his mother and his grandmother. Think about the sheer, breathtaking paradox of his existence. Here was a man who was meticulously constructing the most intimidating, indestructible physical facade on the planet. He was building 57-inch chest muscles designed to project absolute, godlike immortality. But beneath the thick layers of perfectly tanned, oiled muscle, his heart was a fragile, ticking time bomb. The ultimate alpha male was walking the earth with an incredibly delicate, compromised core. He was a fortress built on top of a geological fault line. Driven by an insatiable, roaring hunger to escape the black bathwater thaw, the young, muscular giant set his sights on the distant, glittering shores of America. He was preparing to cross the ocean, conquer the bodybuilding universe, and aggressively bulldoze his way into the highest echelons of Hollywood royalty. But he did not know that the relentless, Machiavellian arrogance required to conquer the globe was quietly forging a completely different kind of weapon. He believed he was leaving the filth and the chaos of his childhood permanently behind in Europe. But the young conqueror was entirely unaware that the most destructive, humiliating, and catastrophic mess of his entire life was not going to be found in an Austrian pit latrine. It was going to be created by his own hands, waiting patiently in the shadows of a multi-million-dollar California mansion, preparing to detonate and blow his perfect, golden kingdom entirely to ash. The Iron Temple, the Kennedy Crown, and the arrogance of conquest. There is a highly intoxicating, almost feral energy that drives a man who arrives on foreign shores with absolutely nothing to lose. When 21-year-old Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped onto the sun-baked concrete of Los Angeles in 1968, he did not bring the polite, hesitant humility of a traditional immigrant. He brought the ruthless, calculating, and predatory ambition of an emperor who had simply not yet acquired his throne. He walked into Gold's Gym in Venice Beach. To understand the sheer, brutal physical alchemy of those early years, you must strip away the glamorous, neon-lit nostalgia of 1970s California. You must smell the stale, suffocating scent of dried sweat, cheap chalk dust, and rusted iron. The gym was a dungeon of pain. But for Arnold, it was a holy temple. He spent hours beneath the crushing, terrifying weight of the barbells, intentionally tearing the fibers of his own flesh, so they would heal thicker, denser, and more impenetrable than before. He was not merely building physique. He was frantically, aggressively pouring concrete over the shivering, humiliated Austrian boy who had once been forced to bathe in his family's freezing, filthy water. He won the Mr. Olympia title a staggering 7 times. He became the undisputed, absolute apex predator of the bodybuilding universe. His physical form mutated into a living, breathing topographical map of exaggerated, impossible human mountains. He had conquered the flesh. But for a man possessed by a bottomless, roaring psychological hunger, conquering a niche sport was merely the opening act. He turned his eyes toward the shimmering, multi-billion-dollar fortress of Hollywood. The industry executives looked at the massive, vascular behemoth and laughed directly in his face. They subjected him to the exact same cruel, clinical degradation that breaks thousands of aspiring actors every single day. They told him his body was too grotesque, too freakish for mainstream cinema. They told him his surname was an unpronounceable alphabetical nightmare. And above all, they mocked his incredibly thick, guttural, and mechanical Austrian accent. They told him to go back to Europe. But Arnold Schwarzenegger did not retreat. He did not hire dialect coaches to erase his voice. He did not change his name to something simple and American. He looked at the rigid, impenetrable walls of Hollywood, and instead of trying to find a door, he simply decided to smash through the brick. In 1984, a brilliant, visionary director named James Cameron was casting a low-budget, gritty science fiction thriller called The Terminator. When Cameron met Arnold, he realized a profound, terrifying cinematic truth. The very flaws that Hollywood despised, the stiff, robotic movements, the emotionless, heavily accented voice, the massive, unnatural frame, were not liabilities. They were the exact, flawless ingredients of a ruthless, unstoppable killing machine. Arnold did not have to pretend to be a cyborg sent from the future to annihilate everything in its path. He merely had to channel the cold, calculating, and utterly unsentimental discipline he had used to survive his own childhood. "I'll be back." When he delivered that line, deadpan and entirely devoid of human empathy, it wasn't just dialogue. It was a cultural earthquake. The film exploded. Arnold did not adapt to Hollywood. He forced the entire global cinematic aesthetic to adapt to him. He redefined the very concept of the American action hero. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, with monstrous, global hits like Predator, Commando, and Total Recall, he became the highest paid, most universally recognized movie star on the face of the planet. He had the millions. He had the global adoration. He had entirely erased the poverty of Thal. But extreme, unchecked ambition is an incredibly dangerous, insatiable parasite. Arnold realized that wealth and fame were the currencies of the new world, but they did not purchase true, historical legitimacy. He was still, deep down, an Austrian farm boy holding a large bank account. To completely, permanently sever his ties to his peasant origins, he needed something that money could not directly buy. He needed aristocracy. He needed royal blood. In 1977, at a charity tennis tournament, the massive, rugged bodybuilder crossed paths with a beautiful, fiercely intelligent, and incredibly polished young journalist named Maria Shriver. Maria was not just a television reporter. She was a niece of President John F. Kennedy. She was the absolute, undisputed embodiment of the American aristocracy. She possessed a refined Ivy League pedigree, the sprawling family compounds in Hyannisport, and the deep, invisible network of absolute political power that defines the highest echelon of the United States. For Arnold, winning the heart of Maria Shriver was not merely a romance. It was the ultimate, magnificent, and breathtakingly audacious conquest. They were married on April 26, 1986, in a spectacular, highly publicized Catholic ceremony in Hyannis, Massachusetts. Imagine the sheer, staggering psychological triumph of that exact moment. The boy who was once forced to use a freezing, foul-smelling pit latrine in the rural countryside of Austria, listening to humiliating drop of human waste in the dark, was now sleeping in incredibly luxurious beds wrapped in the velvet exclusivity of the Kennedy dynasty. He had completely infiltrated the most powerful family in America. He had literally married into the throne. As the 1990s arrived, the Arnold Schwarzenegger empire was an absolute, blinding monolith of perfection. He was earning $20 million a movie. He had a brilliant, aristocratic wife. Together, they began to welcome four beautiful, perfectly polished children, Catherine, Christina, Patrick, and Christopher. They lived in a sprawling, highly secure, breathtakingly expensive mansion in the exclusive enclave of Brentwood, California. To the outside world, Arnold was the ultimate, flawless patriarch. He had hacked the universe. He had manipulated the American dream with the cold, precise calculations of a chess grandmaster, bending every single variable of human existence to his exact will. But there's a fatal, incredibly toxic poison that seeps into the bloodstream of a man who has never lost a battle. When you spend 30 years systematically crushing every obstacle, defeating every rival, and successfully ignoring the rules that govern ordinary mortals, you begin to develop a profound, terrifying arrogance. You begin to believe that gravity does not apply to you. You begin to believe that you are entirely, permanently untouchable. He stood on the balcony of his magnificent California estate, looking out over a kingdom that he had built entirely with his own bare hands. He was the undisputed master of the universe. But the tragic, blinding flaw of absolute invincibility is hubris. The emperor was looking so far out over his conquered territories that he completely failed to notice the devastating, catastrophic flaw hiding directly beneath his own roof. He believed he had permanently locked the dirt, the shame, and the chaos of his past safely outside the heavy iron gates of his Brentwood mansion. He was incredibly, tragically mistaken. The absolute most destructive, humiliating, and permanently scarring bomb of his entire existence had already been quietly planted. It wasn't orchestrated by a rival studio. It wasn't a political smear campaign. It was an explosive charge that he had arrogantly, recklessly wired with his own hands, hiding in plain sight in quiet, mundane shadows of his own pristine hallways. And the timer on that bomb was ticking down to a zero that would completely, violently obliterate the golden castle he had spent his entire life building. The governor's throne, the invisible sun, and the arrogance of deception. There's a profoundly dangerous, incredibly seductive psychological disease that infects men who have never lost a war. When you spend 3 decades systematically destroying every single obstacle in your path, when you conquer the unforgiving iron of the gym, shatter the linguistic barriers of Hollywood, and successfully infiltrate the most powerful, aristocratic political family in the history of the United States, a dark, insidious mutation occurs within your soul. You stop viewing reality as a set of rules that apply to everyone else. You begin to believe that you are the sole, undisputed architect of the universe. You believe that you can bend time, manipulate the truth, and compartmentalize your sins with the exact same flawless, mechanical precision you use to load a barbell. By the late 1990s, Arnold Schwarzenegger was not just a movie star. He was a multimillionaire, a dedicated Republican political force, and a highly polished, fiercely protected family man. He had a beautiful, brilliant Kennedy wife, 4 immaculate children, and an immense, sprawling estate in Brentwood, California. But behind the heavy, wrought iron gates of that fortress, the emperor had committed an act of staggering, almost incomprehensible recklessness. In 1996, while his wife, Maria Shriver, was pregnant with their 4th child, Christopher, Arnold engaged in a deeply hidden, intimate relationship with Mildred Patricia Baena. Mildred was not a glamorous Hollywood starlet. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was a quiet, unassuming woman who had worked for the Schwarzenegger family for nearly 2 decades as their housekeeper and nanny. This was not a fleeting, anonymous encounter in a distant hotel room. This was a betrayal committed within the very sanctuary he had promised to protect. In October of 1997, Mildred gave birth to a son, Joseph. Just days earlier, Maria had given birth to Christopher. Stop and consider the sheer, terrifying, and utterly surreal magnitude of that specific timeline. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who understand that trust is the absolute, foundational bedrock of a 50-year marriage, the psychological reality of what Arnold Schwarzenegger orchestrated over the next 14 years is an absolute, chilling masterclass in deception. He didn't pay Mildred to disappear. He didn't hide the child in another country. Mildred continued to work in the house. She continued to cook the meals. She continued to clean the floors of the Brentwood mansion. And little Joseph, the secret, illegitimate son of the biggest action star on the planet, grew up running through the exact same hallways, playing in the exact same kitchen, and swimming in the exact same pool as Arnold's legitimate, aristocratic children. Maria Shriver, a brilliant, highly educated journalist, treated the boy with kindness, completely, entirely unaware that the child she was watching grow up was half of her own husband's blood. "I had a major failure," Arnold would confess decades later, long after the explosion had burned his kingdom to ash, his voice heavy with the grim, agonizing reality of a man looking back at his own destruction. "It was my biggest failure. It was the biggest failure of my life. It was the biggest failure of my life." Listen to the stark, absolute emptiness of that admission. He was a man who had obsessively, frantically spent his entire existence running away from the filthy, humiliating black bathwater of his Austrian childhood. He had sworn to build a perfect, clean, unblemished life. And yet, driven by the very same primal, chaotic arrogance that made him successful, he had quietly polluted the very center of his own home. He had constructed a massive, complex lie, and he lived inside of it every single day. He compartmentalized betrayal, neatly storing it in a dark, silent box in the back of his mind, convincing himself that as long as he provided the money, the security, and the public smiles, the box would remain permanently locked. The illusion of control was so absolute, so incredibly intoxicating, that in 2003, the man who was secretly harboring one of the most explosive scandals in modern history made the most audacious, spectacular gamble of his entire existence. He decided to run for the governor of California. In a staggering, highly publicized, and fiercely contested recall election, Arnold stepped out from behind movie cameras and onto the chaotic, unforgiving stage of American politics. He faced intense, brutal media scrutiny. His past was aggressively excavated. Rumors of his behavior on movie sets were heavily debated on national television. But the secret of Joseph remained buried deep within the walls of the Brentwood estate. The fortress held. In November 2003, Arnold Schwarzenegger won the election. He was re-elected in 2006. For 7 years, the boy from Thal, Austria, governed the most populous, economically powerful state in the Union. He sat behind a massive desk in Sacramento, commanding an economy larger than most countries on Earth. He was the governor. He had achieved a level of political and cultural supremacy that defied all logical explanation. He was the absolute, undisputed king of the world. He believed he had successfully outsmarted the universe. He believed he had permanently outrun the consequences of his actions. He was a 70-something-year-old titan, finishing his final term in office, preparing to ride quietly into the golden, triumphant sunset of elder statesmanship. But as the calendar turned toward the fateful year 2011, a slow, incredibly terrifying and undeniable physical transformation was quietly taking place inside the walls of his home. The universe, which had patiently, silently watched the king build his empire of lies for 14 years, was finally preparing to collect the debt. And it wasn't going to use a reporter, a political rival, or a leaked document to destroy him. The universe was going to use biology. As young Joseph transitioned from a boy into a teenager, the undeniable genetic blueprint of the Schwarzenegger bloodline began to aggressively assert itself. The boy's shoulders broadened. His jawline sharpened. His smile, his features, and his physical presence became an exact, unmistakable mirror image of the man who had conquered the bodybuilding world in the 1970s. The boy who had been hidden in plain sight was no longer invisible. He was a walking, breathing confession. Maria Shriver, possessing the sharp, intuitive brilliance of a woman who had spent decades navigating complex, often deceptive waters of power, finally saw the truth. The secret that Arnold had desperately, obsessively guarded for 14 grueling years was about to detonate. The absolute master of the universe was entirely unaware that the heavy, ornate doors of his magnificent sanctuary were about to be permanently locked from the inside, forcing him to stand naked, shivering, and completely alone in the ashes of the very family he had sacrificed his soul to build. The quiet reckoning, the shattered crown, and the weight of the truth. There's a magnificent, terrifying delusion that accompanies absolute power. When a man has spent half a century bending the entire world to his iron will, successfully maneuvering through the brutal gauntlet of bodybuilding, the cynical machinery of Hollywood, and the ruthless bloodsport of American politics, he inevitably develops a fatal psychological blind spot. He stops believing that the laws of gravity apply to him. He believes that the fortress he has constructed is permanently immune to the consequences of his own actions. By the dawn of 2011, Arnold Schwarzenegger was standing at the absolute, untouchable summit of his extraordinary existence. He was 63 years old. He had just successfully concluded a historic, 2-term tenure as a governor of California. He had governed an economy larger than most sovereign nations. He had navigated massive budget crises, natural disasters, and intense political warfare. He was preparing to transition out of public office, ready to reclaim his cinematic throne, and looking forward to enjoying profound, respected elder statesman status he had earned alongside his brilliant, deeply devoted wife, Maria Shriver, and therefore beautiful children. The script for his twilight years was perfectly, immaculately written. The golden boy of the Austrian Alps had won the ultimate game, but the universe, operating with its trademark, incredibly patient and mathematically precise sense of justice, was merely waiting for the king to take his final bow before dropping the guillotine. The secret that Arnold had desperately, obsessively locked in the darkest basement of his mind for 14 years, the existence of his illegitimate son, Joseph, born to his housekeeper, Mildred Baena, was no longer invisible. As Joseph had grown from a toddler into a teenager, the unmistakable, prominent, and rugged physical architecture of the Schwarzenegger bloodline had violently asserted itself across the boy's face. It was a walking, breathing confession living under Arnold's own roof. Maria Shriver was an incredibly intelligent, highly perceptive woman who had spent decades navigating complex, often deceptive waters of the Kennedy political dynasty. She had felt the agonizing, quiet friction in her home for years. And finally, she connected the devastating, horrifying pieces of the puzzle. In early 2011, shortly after Arnold left the governor's office, Maria confronted him. To fully comprehend the sheer, unadulterated psychological cataclysm of that exact moment, you must strip away the glamorous illusion of the international movie star. You must utilize the terrifying power of emotional slow motion. Imagine the incredibly sterile, suffocating silence of a couple's counseling session. The room is quiet. The ticking of a clock echoes off the walls. The man who has spent his entire life projecting an aura of absolute unbreakable, robotic perfection is sitting on a sofa, looking into the eyes of the woman who has anchored his soul for 25 years. Maria looks at the invincible Terminator, and she asks a single, devastatingly simple question. She asks if he is the father of Mildred's son. In that fraction of a microsecond, the massive multi-million-dollar empire of Arnold Schwarzenegger completely, violently collapsed into dust. There was no explosion. There were no reporters screaming questions. There was only the crushing, unbearable realization that he had absolutely nowhere left to hide. The man who could effortlessly charm global leaders, who could command the attention of 100 million voters, and who had spent his life insisting that he would be back, was completely, fundamentally disarmed. He looked at his wife, and the heavy, agonizing truth finally, permanently shattered his golden armor. I told her the truth. Arnold would later confess in a rare, remarkably raw interview, his deep voice stripped of all its cinematic bravado, revealing the exhausted, heavily scar-hard of a man who had destroyed his own kingdom. I said, "Yes, Maria. Joseph is my son." She was crushed. I had inflicted unbelievable pain on Maria and unbelievable pain on the kids. She was crushed. I had inflicted unbelievable pain. Listen to the absolute, majestic tragedy buried inside that admission. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who have spent decades building a family, pouring their absolute soul into a marriage, only to discover betrayal so profound, so intimately cruel that it completely rewrites the entire history of their existence. That sentence is an agonizing masterclass in devastation. He had not just cheated on his wife. He had structurally, methodically deceived her for 14 years, allowing his illegitimate child to grow up alongside her own children, in her own house. He had weaponized her kindness and her trust. On May 9, 2011, Maria and Arnold released a joint statement announcing their separation. A few days later, the Los Angeles Times published the explosive, unthinkable truth about the loved child. The global reaction was immediate, ruthless, and absolute. The media, which had spent 30 years worshiping his physical perfection and political acumen, viciously turned on him. They dissected his arrogance. They mocked his hypocrisy. They painted a picture of an aging, reckless egomaniac who believed he was entirely above the moral laws of human decency. The pristine, bulletproof brand of the Governator was dragged to the mud of late-night talk shows and sensational tabloid headlines. But the public humiliation, however intense, was incredibly minor compared to profound, silent devastation occurring within his own family. His 4 children with Maria, Catherine, Christina, Patrick, and Christopher, were completely, utterly blindsided. Their father, the invincible superhero they had idolized their entire lives, had fundamentally betrayed their mother and shattered their reality. The trust was entirely broken. The massive, beautiful Brentwood estate that had been the ultimate symbol of his triumph over the poverty of his Austrian youth had been permanently poisoned by his own arrogance. Arnold Schwarzenegger was suddenly the most hated man in America. He moved out of the family home. He was a 64-year-old billionaire, a cinematic legend and a political titan, but as he sat alone in a quiet, unfamiliar room, he was forced to confront the horrifying reality that he had completely, entirely failed as a human being. For a man whose entire psychological framework was built on the concept of conquering, the divorce from Maria Shriver was the ultimate, unsurvivable defeat. He could not flex his muscles to fix the damage. He could not charm his way back into her heart. The man who had spent his life treating his body like an indestructible machine was finally forced to acknowledge that a machine cannot repair a broken soul. He had to learn, for the first time in his life, how to surrender. He had to learn how to exist in the uncomfortable, humiliating space of fallen idol. "I can beat myself up as much as I want," Arnold later reflected, demonstrating a profound, hard-earned maturity that only comes from staring into the abyss of your own failures. It's not going to change the situation. So the key thing is, how do you move forward? How do you have a great relationship with your kids? How do you have a great relationship with your ex-wife? As the 2010s progressed, Arnold embarked on a grueling, incredibly quiet campaign of redemption. He did not ask for public pity. He took full financial and emotional responsibility for Joseph, integrating him into his life with a fierce, unapologetic love that refused to hide the boy in the shadows any longer. He worked tirelessly, painstakingly, to repair the fractured bonds with his other 4 children, accepting their anger and giving them the space they needed to heal. He slowly, methodically stepped back into the cinematic world, returning to the Terminator franchise and starring in smaller, grittier films. But the swagger was different. The invincible aura was gone, replaced by a weathered, deeply scarred gravity. He had survived the collapse of his empire. He had faced the horrifying consequences of his own arrogance, and he had managed to salvage a fragile, complicated peace with the family he had nearly destroyed. He believed the worst was behind him. He was approaching his 70s, confident that his legendary, superhuman physique, the very foundation of his entire existence, the magnificent 57-inch chest that had carried him out of freezing slums of Austria, would comfortably sustain him through his twilight years. But the universe, operating with its incredibly patient, terrifying memory, was quietly preparing to collect its final, most intimate debt. The invisible, genetic time bomb that had been silently ticking inside his massive chest for 7 decades was finally preparing to detonate. And the man who had survived the destruction of his public reputation was about to be wheeled into an operating room, entirely unconscious, unaware that a catastrophic surgical error was about to push him closer to the absolute, freezing edge of death than he had ever been before. The defective engine, the white scar, and the betrayal of the machine. There's a profound, almost mythological arrogance embedded deep within the psychology of a man who builds his own body. When you spend 3 decades meticulously, obsessively transforming soft human tissue into impenetrable granite, you begin to believe a very specific, dangerous lie. You convince yourself that because you can control the shape of your biceps, the width of your shoulders, and the astonishing 57-inch expanse of your chest, you have successfully conquered the biological limitations of mortality. You believe you are no longer a fragile human being. You believe you are a machine. But the universe, operating with an incredibly cold, mathematically precise cruelty, does not care about the size of a man's muscles. The universe only cares about the microscopic, invisible architecture hidden beneath the skin. For his entire life, Arnold Schwarzenegger had carried a terrifying, silent assassin inside the very center of his magnificent, heavily armored fortress. He was born with a bicuspid aortic valve. In a healthy human heart, this vital gateway possesses 3 delicate, perfectly synchronized leaflets that regulate the massive, rushing flow of blood. Arnold's heart only possessed 2. It was a rare, insidious genetic defect. It was the exact same silent, invisible executioner that had relentlessly stalked his bloodline, eventually claiming the lives of both his mother and his grandmother. To fully comprehend the sheer, unadulterated psychological horror of that specific reality, you must strip away the glamorous illusion of the 7-time Mr. Olympia. You must look purely at the agonizing paradox of his existence. He was universally worshipped as the ultimate, undisputed pinnacle of human physical perfection. He was the Terminator, He was a man who survived explosions, hunted alien predators in the jungle, and projected an aura of absolute, unbreakable immortality. But inside, his engine was fundamentally, genetically defective. The ultimate alpha male was walking the earth with a fragile, ticking time bomb in his chest. In 1997, at the age of 50, the time bomb demanded its first payment. Arnold was forced to undergo an incredibly invasive, high-stakes procedure to replace the failing valve. The operation required surgeons to crack open his massive, famous chest, exposing his beating heart to the cold, sterile air of the operating room. Imagine the incredibly visceral, suffocating horror of that realization. For a man who had spent his entire life desperately trying to outrun the freezing, dark, and humiliating poverty of an Austrian pit latrine by building a body that nobody could ever break, being forced to lie unconscious, sliced open on an operating table, is a form of psychological torture that defies human language. He was completely, fundamentally powerless. It was the first time I felt truly vulnerable, Arnold later confessed in a rare, agonizingly honest interview, his voice stripped of all its cinematic bravado, revealing the exhausted, heavily scarred heart of a mortal man. You wake up, and there's tubes coming out of you everywhere. You realize you're not a machine. You're just a guy who needs fixing. You realize you're not a machine. You're just a guy who needs fixing. Listen to the absolute, majestic humility buried inside that admission. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who have been abruptly, violently reminded of their own mortality, who have woken up in a freezing hospital room smelling the sharp, metallic scent of iodine and antiseptic, staring at the ceiling and realizing that their bodies are no longer invincible, that sentence strikes a raw, bleeding nerve. You cannot flex your way out of a hospital bed. The 1997 surgery left a long, jagged, white surgical scar down the center of his perfect chest. It was a permanent, physical receipt for the cost of survival. But artificial valves, much like Hollywood careers, do not last forever. They degrade. They wear out. And as the calendar turned toward the late 2010s, the aging titan was preparing to face an even more terrifying, catastrophic medical ordeal. In the spring of 2018, Arnold was 70 years old. He was scheduled for what was supposed to be a routine, non-invasive catheter procedure to replace the pulmonary valve. It was a planned maintenance operation, designed to avoid the brutal trauma of opening his chest a second time. But destiny does not respect the surgical schedule. During the delicate procedure, a catastrophic, terrifying complication occurred. The surgical team accidentally punctured the wall of his heart. The situation instantly escalated from a routine procedure into a massive 5-alarm life-or-death crisis. Blood was pouring into his chest cavity. The doctors had mere minutes to save the life of the global icon. They frantically initiated emergency, open-heart surgery. They violently cracked his sternum for the second time, desperately fighting to repair the damage, and replaced the valve before the clock completely ran out. When Arnold finally awoke from the heavy, suffocating fog of anesthesia, the scene he encountered was an absolute sterile nightmare. The doctors, speaking in hushed, clinical tones, stood over the 70-year-old giant. They explained how incredibly close he had come to the absolute edge of the abyss. They told him that they had to rip his chest open to save his life. The recovery was agonizing, exhausting, and deeply humiliating. The man who used to deadlift hundreds of pounds with effortless, swaggering arrogance was now forced to use a walker just to shuffle a few feet down the hospital corridor. He was gasping for breath, relying on nurses to help him perform the most basic, fundamental functions of human existence. He had survived the scandal that destroyed his marriage. He had survived the brutal, merciless ridicule of the global press. And now, he had barely survived his own failing heart. But the relentless, invisible barrage on Arnold Schwarzenegger's physical body was still not finished. Just 2 years later, in 2020, at the age of 73, the universe struck yet again. He was forced to undergo a third major heart surgery, this time to replace the aortic valve. Once again, the surgeons opened a heavy, scarred chest. Once again, he woke up surrounded by the terrifying, rhythmic hissing of ventilators and the blinding glare of fluorescent lights. The physical toll of these relentless, invasive procedures compounded with the chronic, agonizing joint pain he suffered from decades of extreme, punishing weightlifting. His knees ached. His shoulders throbbed with a hot, sickening fire. The body that had conquered the world was slowly, methodically collapsing under the immense, accumulated gravity of his own ambition. He was in his late 70s now. The invincible Terminator was covered in scars. He had successfully navigated the turbulent, chaotic storms of his personal life, finding a quiet, beautiful harbor in his relationship with his children and his ex-wife, Maria. He had accepted the public humiliation. He had paid his debts. He believed with absolute reasonable certainty that the universe had finally, permanently closed a ledger on his physical suffering. He believed he had endured the absolute worst the medical establishment could possibly throw at him. But the universe, operating with its incredibly patient, malicious memory, was merely pausing to let him catch his breath. As the calendar flipped toward the year 2024, the 76-year-old patriarch was entirely unaware that the most intimate, profound, and deeply ironic mechanical intervention of his entire life was quietly waiting in the shadows. The man who had spent 40 years playing a cyborg sent from the future was about to undergo a procedure that would permanently, irreversibly blur the line between human flesh and artificial machinery. The ultimate unsurvivable nightmare of his youth was about to become his daily reality, forcing the aging king to confront the absolute, terrifying frailty of his own magnificent, failing heart. Pacemaker, the echoes of iron and the ultimate reconciliation. There is a terrifying, breathtaking poetry in the way the universe completes the arc of a human life. We spend decades furiously writing our own scripts, desperately trying to outrun the fragile, mortal realities of our biology. We build massive empires of wealth, and we construct impenetrable, muscular fortresses to convince the world and ourselves that we're entirely immune to the decay of time. But time is the ultimate, undefeated conqueror. It strips away the vanity. It completely dismantles the armor. And eventually, it leaves you with nothing but the absolute, unvarnished truth of your own humanity. As Arnold Schwarzenegger marched into his late 70s, the astronomical toll of his extraordinary, punishing life began to relentlessly collect its final debts. He had survived the explosive, world-shattering scandal that destroyed his marriage. He had survived the brutal, open-heart surgeries that left long, jagged white scars down the center of his famous chest. But the surgical interventions had left a lingering, invisible phantom inside his cardiovascular system. The heavy scar tissue from his previous operations had severely disrupted his heartbeat, triggering a dangerous, unpredictable arrhythmia. In March of 2024, the medical establishment delivered a final, undeniable ultimatum. The aging king was forced back into the sterile, blinding glare of the operating room. To regulate the erratic, failing rhythm of his damaged heart, surgeons had to implant a pacemaker. Imagine the sheer mind-bending and absolute cinematic irony of that specific moment. Remember the freezing, impoverished boy in Thal, Austria. Remember the child who stood in his cramped, dirt-floor kitchen, utterly mesmerized by the low, steady, mechanical hum of his family's very first refrigerator. He had fallen in love with the concept of the machine because machines did not feel cold. Machines did not feel shame. He had spent his entire adult life projecting the terrifying, emotionless immortality of a cyborg assassin on the silver screen. He had played the Terminator. And now, at 76 years old, lying in a hospital bed, a literal, battery-powered piece of machinery was permanently wired into the center of his chest just to keep him alive. He was quite literally part machine. For a man whose entire psychological foundation was built on the arrogant, supreme domination of his own physical body, Relying on a mechanical device to survive could have been an agonizing, humiliating defeat. He could have hidden the surgery. He could have deployed his publicists to aggressively bury the medical reports, desperately clinging to the illusion of his indestructible youth. But Arnold Schwarzenegger did not hide. He emerged from the hospital and immediately spoke to his millions of fans with profound, startling vulnerability. "I have a pacemaker now," he announced, flashing that legendary, gap-toothed smile, his voice carrying the deep, seasoned warmth of a man who has finally stopped fighting his own mortality. "I am a little bit more of a machine now." He turned his own physical decline into a beacon of encouragement, using his massive global platform to urge his aging fans to prioritize their health, to go to the doctor, and to stop ignoring the warning signs of their own bodies. The arrogance of the conqueror had completely evaporated. The humility of a survivor had taken its place. Today, in the spring of 2026, Arnold Schwarzenegger is 78 years old. To look at him now is to witness the magnificent, heavy archaeology of a life lived at the absolute, terrifying extremes of the human condition. He lives a quiet, deliberately grounded life on the outskirts of Los Angeles. But the physical reality of his 78 years is a daily, grueling negotiation. Beyond a ticking pacemaker in his chest, his skeletal frame carries the agonizing, invisible invoice for his legendary ambition. The decades of hoisting thousands of pounds of rusted iron in freezing gymnasiums, the brutal, bone-jarring cinematic stunts performed on concrete floors, they all left a permanent mark. His knees ache with a hot, sickening fire on cold mornings. His massive shoulders grind with the chronic, inescapable pain of multiple joint surgeries. The 57-inch chest is gone. The armor is incredibly heavy. But for the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who wake up every morning and feel the sharp, stinging receipt of their own lifetime of hard labor, who understand that every ache and every scar is simply the price of admission for a life fully lived, Arnold's physical decline is not a tragedy. It is a badge of absolute honor. He is no longer running away from the black, freezing bathwater of his Austrian childhood. When he sits in the golden, peaceful sunlight of his California estate, surrounded by his animals, he is surrounded by a completely different kind of wealth. He looks at his children, Catherine, Christina, Patrick, Christopher, and Joseph. He does not command them like a general. He loves them like a deeply flawed, profoundly remorseful father who spent the last 15 years painstakingly, humbly gluing the shattered pieces of his family back together. He completely embraced Joseph, the son born of his greatest, most humiliating failure, ensuring that the boy felt the fierce, unconditional pride of his father. He repaired the burned bridges with his ex-wife, Maria Shriver, transforming the bitter ashes of their divorce into a profound, respectful, and deeply supportive friendship. He realized that you cannot flex your way out of guilt. You cannot bribe forgiveness. You can only earn it through absolute, quiet, and consistent contrition. When we step back and look at the majestic, turbulent, and utterly incomparable totality of Arnold Schwarzenegger's 78 years on Earth, the true meaning of his legacy finally comes into perfect focus. He was not a god. He was never a machine. He was a fiercely ambitious, deeply insecure boy who built a fortress of muscle to protect himself from the humiliations of poverty. He conquered the globe with a ruthless, blinding arrogance. And when that arrogance inevitably burned his kingdom to the ground, he did the hardest thing a proud man could ever do. He stayed in the ruins. He apologized. And he spent the rest of his life quietly rebuilding the sanctuary he had broken. The heavy, rusted iron of the gym has long been put away. The political campaigns are over. The cameras have stopped rolling. But as the 78-year-old titan sits quietly in his garden, listening to the faint, steady, mechanical ticking of his own heart, he has finally achieved the one victory that eluded him his entire life. The boy from Thal doesn't need to fight his way to the front of the line anymore. He doesn't need to conquer the world to prove he belongs in it. The ultimate Terminator has finally surrendered. And in that beautiful, magnificent surrender, he finally found his peace. As we close the book on the explosive, tragic, and profoundly redemptive journey of Arnold Schwarzenegger, the camera turns away from the Hollywood legend, and it focuses gently, deeply on you. Arnold's story is a powerful reminder that our greatest strength is not found in our physical muscles, nor in the flawless illusions we project to the world. True strength is a terrifying courage to look at the wreckage we have caused, admit our profound mistakes, and spend the rest of our lives making amends. He proved that even the most broken families can find a path to healing if we are willing to drop our pride. What about you? As you navigate the autumn of your own life, what physical or emotional scars are you learning to carry with pride? Have you ever had to swallow your ego to ask for forgiveness from someone you loved? Please, take a moment to share your stories of healing, your hard-earned wisdom, and your journey of finding peace in the comments below. Your honesty might be exactly the beacon of light someone else needs to see today. If this deep, unfiltered look into the heart of a fallen and redeemed king moved you, please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more profound stories behind the legends we love. Thank you, deeply and truly, for your time. Be kind to your own scars, cherish your family, and until next time, keep moving forward.